Let's say we have a list of items that we want to pack for a trip, and for each item, if it's already been packed, we want to show a check mark beside it. In React, this is known as conditional rendering, so let's just take a quick look at how to do this. Before we get too into it, the example that I'm using in this video, I've actually taken straight from the React documentation, so if you want to read more about it, I'll leave the link in the description. To get started, let's look at the code that we're working with. We have a list of items. These are just the items that we're looking to pack. So we have a phone, backpack, tent, shoes, food. And out of all of these, only the phone, the backpack, and the food is packed. Next in our app, we just have a header, and then we have our packing list, and this just takes a list of our list items. If we take a look at packing list in here, it's pretty straightforward. We take the list, and then we just create every single item using another component called item. Looking at the item itself, it's just displaying the name, but in here is where we actually want to have the logic for the check mark. So to get started, one of the first and most straightforward ways of doing this is by just using an if statement. So if we were to go in here and just add an if statement, so if is packed, and this would simply just return a different div where before the name, we would just have a check mark. So it would simply just look like this. Now, if we look back at our list, we'll notice that all the ones that are packed will have the check mark. The other thing with this method is that if, let's say, for example, we want to hide the packed items, instead of returning this, we can just return null. And looking at our list, all the items that were packed are now hidden. The problem with this code, though, is you'll notice that we have a lot of repeated code here. And the way to go about this is by using a ternary. If you've never used a ternary before, the layout is basically as follows. We have the condition, or I'll just make this a comment. So we have our condition, and then based on what this condition is returning, if this condition is true, then we do this, and then colon, if the condition is false, else we do this. If this is also confusing, we can also look at it this way. If is packed, we return that, and if else, we return null. If you look at this check right here, a different way of writing this would be with a ternary, and that would look kind of like this. We would put the div here, and the null would be here after the colon. These two expressions are exactly identical, but this one is just a more straightforward one-liner method, which is a lot cleaner when it comes to JSX. So how can we take this and use the checkmark method and apply it to the name? To do this, so let's just get rid of this. And now return name will just look something like this. So we have to check for is packed. If it is packed, then we'll have the check mark plus the name. Else, it'll just be the name. And I'll just copy and paste the check mark here. And this is exactly the same as the first if statement that we wrote. And we have our check mark for items that were packed and no check mark for the items that weren't. Now we could also get a bit more creative with this and insert a tag here. So we could say, we could put the delete tag, and we also have to put this in squiggly brackets. And now everything just has a line through it, which is basically just easier to read, but doesn't do much beside that. Now there's an even shorter method of doing this, and it's by just using an and. So let's just write it first, then I'll try explaining it. Let's go back to is packed. So we have our is packed here, and then we can do and show our check mark. And then also we want the name. You'll see that we have the exact same outcome. This right here is just the equivalent of, let's say if we just had if is packed and we just returned the check mark here. This is the exact same as doing this. So whenever is packed is true, we just return the check mark. Otherwise, if this is false, it returns false and React won't display that. This works really well when this value is a Boolean, but the problem here is when we have a different value, especially if we have a number or even a nan. So not a number. This would actually show up on the front end. This, although possible, you probably won't see that often. But the thing that you will see a lot more often is, let's say we had an array, so we'll do a const my list, and this is an empty array. If I was to do my list.length, where let's say if I had any items in this list, I wanted to show the check mark, we don't actually get the expected outcome here. What React's end up displaying is a bunch of zeros here, and this is definitely not what we want, and this is one of those mistakes where if you're new to React, it can catch you off guard. When it comes to values like numbers, React actually ends up displaying those, so if we wanted to make this work the same way, we would just say if length is equal to 0, then display the check mark. So now on the front end, we'll see that all of them have the check mark just because the check applies to all of them. But since our value is a Boolean, this works just fine for us. So although this is a lot shorter and cleaner, you definitely have to watch out for a few things with it, but it's by far the most common way I've seen people do conditional logic within React. Another thing to point out is if you find yourself doing things like if is packed, and from here returning, let's say you had a massive component here. If this is really big, then a lot of the time I'll ask myself, should this just be a component itself instead of just having all the logic in here? So definitely another thing to look out for. Most of the time where you'll end up doing this is if you have, for example, a loading state. If the data isn't loaded yet, you'll just return the loading state instead of displaying anything else. And one last thing, whenever you don't want to display anything, one of the options is a fragment, the other one is just returning null, and even undefined would end up not showing anything on the UI. So those are definitely things you want to keep in mind, but if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.